The room was quiet. There were no signs of a struggle. No broken furniture. No shattered glass. Nothing suggested violence had interrupted the evening. Just a husband lying unresponsive in his bedroom. Only hours earlier, 40-year-old Eric Richins had celebrated a business milestone with his wife. According to her account, they shared dinner, enjoyed dessert, and ended the evening with a Moscow Mule before she left to comfort one of their young sons after a nightmare. When she returned to the master bedroom, she said she found Eric cold and unresponsive. Emergency responders initially believed they were dealing with a sudden medical emergency. But within weeks, one question transformed a private family tragedy into one of the most closely watched homicide investigations in America. What if Eric Richins had never intended to drink that final cocktail? Long before the headlines, Eric had built a reputation as a careful businessman. Friends described him as methodical, someone who studied contracts, avoided unnecessary risks, and focused on long-term stability. Through years of work, he had built a successful construction company and accumulated substantial assets. His wife, Kouri Richins, projected a different energy. Ambitious and outgoing, she was increasingly focused on real estate development. Utah's booming housing market presented opportunities for rapid growth, and she pursued projects that promised significant returns. Together, they appeared to represent the American dream. They were raising 3 sons, owned attractive homes, and enjoyed successful careers. To those around them, the future looked secure. Behind that image, however, investigators would later uncover growing tension over money, trust, and financial control. Those disagreements remained largely private. Friends saw family photographs. Business associates watched new projects move forward. Neighbors saw what appeared to be an ordinary household. But as detectives reconstructed the months leading to Eric's death, they found evidence that financial decisions had become an increasing source of conflict. Eric had spent years building his business and carefully managing his assets. Court testimony later showed he had reviewed insurance policies, updated estate planning documents, and taken steps to protect his financial interests. At the time, those decisions appeared routine. Later, they became central pieces of the investigation. As Kouri expanded her real estate ventures, the projects required financing, loans, and continued investment. Investigators eventually reviewed thousands of financial records, banking transactions, contracts, and emails to determine whether mounting financial pressure played a role in what happened. The records did not initially point to murder. They pointed to a marriage under financial strain. According to testimony presented later at trial, Eric had become increasingly cautious about approving additional borrowing and questioned investments he believed exposed the family to unnecessary risk. The prosecution would later argue those disagreements established motive. The defense maintained they reflected the ordinary financial disputes that occur in many marriages and did not prove criminal intent. Before investigators could evaluate motive, they first had to answer a more fundamental question. How had Eric died? Although generally healthy, he had experienced previous medical issues, making it necessary to consider every possible explanation. Unexpected cardiac events. Undiagnosed illnesses. Drug interactions. Accidental overdoses. Each possibility had to be ruled out before investigators could conclude that a crime had occurred. The turning point came with the autopsy. Toxicology testing revealed an extraordinarily high concentration of fentanyl in Eric's system. The level far exceeded therapeutic use, and the medical examiner determined fentanyl toxicity was the cause of death. The investigation immediately changed. Instead of asking why Eric had died, detectives began asking how fentanyl entered his body. Investigators found no evidence that Eric had been prescribed fentanyl or regularly used illicit opioids. Family members, friends, and colleagues described no history of opioid abuse. If those observations were accurate, detectives had to consider another possibility. Someone had supplied it. The next challenge was determining who, and when. Eric's final day appeared remarkably ordinary. He worked. Handled business matters. Spent time with his family. Nothing suggested he believed he was in danger. Detectives reconstructed nearly every hour of his final days through phone records, financial transactions, text messages, electronic communications, receipts, business schedules, and witness interviews. One interview quickly became central to the investigation. Kouri told detectives she had prepared a Moscow Mule to celebrate Eric's successful business deal. According to her account, the couple shared dinner, dessert, and drinks before she left the bedroom to comfort one of their sons. When she returned later that night, Eric was unresponsive. On its face, the sequence appeared plausible. Parents comfort children during the night. Couples celebrate important milestones. Nothing about those events alone suggested homicide. Investigators, however, do not evaluate statements in isolation. They compare them against objective evidence. Did phone records support the timeline? Did digital evidence match the sequence of events? Did physical evidence align with witness accounts? Those comparisons would shape the direction of the investigation. As detectives continued gathering information, they revisited an incident that had occurred only weeks before Eric's death. Around Valentine's Day, Eric reportedly became seriously ill after consuming food or drink prepared at home. At the time, the illness appeared temporary. No criminal investigation followed, and he eventually recovered. Only after toxicology confirmed fentanyl caused his death did investigators return to that earlier episode. Prosecutors would later argue it represented a failed poisoning attempt. The defense disputed that conclusion, noting no toxicological testing had been performed during the February illness and arguing there was no scientific basis to determine what caused his symptoms. Detectives approached the issue cautiously. Was the earlier illness connected to Eric's death? Or was it an unrelated medical event viewed differently only because investigators now knew the outcome? The distinction mattered. Good investigations test competing explanations rather than forcing every fact into a single theory. Investigators considered whether Eric could have unknowingly obtained fentanyl himself, whether accidental contamination was possible, or whether another person was responsible. Each possibility required evidence. While those questions remained unanswered, another development drew national attention. Less than a year after Eric's death, Kouri published a children's book about helping families cope with the loss of a parent. For many readers, it appeared to be a mother's attempt to help her sons process grief. After the criminal investigation became public, the book attracted intense scrutiny. Its publication was not evidence of homicide, nor did it establish guilt. But it became one of the many reasons the case captured national attention. Public opinion quickly divided. Some believed investigators had uncovered a carefully planned murder motivated by financial pressure. Others urged caution, arguing that conclusions should wait until the evidence had been tested in court. Detectives ignored the public debate. Their focus remained on a single question. How had fentanyl entered Eric Richins' body? Answering it would require investigators to move far beyond the family home, following financial records, digital communications, and personal relationships that gradually revealed a far more complicated picture than anyone had imagined. The investigation now shifted from determining how Eric Richins died to determining who had access to the fentanyl and whether the evidence supported a criminal prosecution. Detectives reconstructed the weeks leading up to March 4, 2022, with extraordinary precision. Search warrants produced phone records, financial documents, banking activity, emails, and data recovered from electronic devices. Every interview was revisited. Every timeline was tested against objective evidence. Eric's communications painted the picture of someone planning for the future. He discussed construction projects, business agreements, and family matters. Investigators found no indication that he expected his life to end or believed he was in immediate danger. At the same time, detectives continued examining the family's finances. Evidence presented later at trial showed Eric had become increasingly cautious about certain business transactions and real estate investments. He had taken steps to strengthen control over assets and limit financial decisions affecting the family's estate. Standing alone, those actions proved nothing. The prosecution would later argue they demonstrated growing conflict over money and control. The defense maintained they reflected prudent financial planning by a successful businessman. Investigators also examined the financial position of Kouri's real estate ventures. Utah's housing market had rewarded aggressive investors for years, but development projects required substantial financing. Loans, construction costs, and carrying expenses could quickly accumulate if projects stalled or markets shifted. Prosecutors argued that financial records reflected increasing pressure. The defense countered that borrowing and refinancing were routine parts of real estate development and did not establish criminal motive. Detectives understood that financial stress alone could not explain a homicide. They still needed evidence connecting motive to action. That search led investigators toward a potential source of the fentanyl. According to the prosecution's evidence, detectives identified communications involving an acquaintance who allegedly supplied pills before Eric's death. The individual later agreed to cooperate with investigators and ultimately became a key witness during the trial. The defense challenged the witness's credibility from the outset, emphasizing his criminal history and arguing he had strong incentives to cooperate with prosecutors. Investigators anticipated those challenges. Rather than relying solely on witness testimony, they searched for independent corroboration through phone records, electronic communications, financial transactions, and location data. Digital evidence became increasingly important. Unlike human memory, electronic records preserve timestamps, communication histories, and patterns of activity that can often be independently verified. Forensic specialists examined phones and digital accounts associated with the investigation, comparing recovered data against witness statements and investigative timelines. Each recovered message provided context. Each timestamp narrowed the sequence of events. Each verified communication either strengthened or weakened competing theories. Detectives also continued interviewing family members, friends, business associates, and others who knew the Richins family. Some described a loving marriage. Others recalled increasing tension over finances and trust. Investigators treated those accounts cautiously. Memories can change after a tragedy. Conversations that once seemed ordinary often take on new meaning in hindsight. For that reason, detectives focused on what could be verified rather than what could simply be remembered. One recurring issue emerged throughout the investigation. Control. Who controlled financial decisions? Who authorized major purchases? Who had authority over real estate transactions? According to testimony presented later in court, Eric had begun taking greater control over significant financial decisions. Prosecutors argued those actions conflicted with Kouri's business ambitions. The defense responded that disagreements over money are common in many marriages and cannot, by themselves, establish criminal intent. Insurance records also became part of the investigation. As in many homicide cases, detectives reviewed policies, beneficiaries, coverage amounts, and estate documents to understand the family's financial circumstances before and after Eric's death. The prosecution argued that insurance proceeds and access to Eric's estate formed part of the overall motive. The defense reminded jurors that life insurance is standard financial planning for families with businesses and young children and should not be viewed as evidence of wrongdoing. Investigators still lacked one critical link. They believed Eric had died from fentanyl poisoning. They had identified possible financial motives. They had assembled timelines, communications, and financial records. What they still needed was evidence connecting those pieces into a coherent sequence. That brought them back to Valentine's Day. If the Valentine's Day illness had been an earlier attempt, it suggested planning. If it had been unrelated, investigators risked assigning meaning to an ordinary medical event simply because they knew what happened later. Rather than treating the incident as proof, detectives considered it alongside the growing body of evidence. They also examined events following Eric's death. Investigators understand that grief is deeply personal. People respond to loss in different ways, and emotional reactions alone cannot establish guilt or innocence. Instead, detectives focused on measurable actions. Financial transactions. Business activity. Communications. Legal filings. According to evidence presented at trial, prosecutors argued that several post-death financial decisions were consistent with someone seeking control of assets and continuing real estate projects. The defense offered innocent explanations for those same actions, noting that surviving spouses often must make immediate financial and legal decisions while managing an estate and caring for children. The same evidence supported two competing interpretations. Months passed as the investigation expanded. Financial analysts reviewed complex business records. Digital forensic specialists produced extensive reports. Detectives worked closely with prosecutors to determine whether the accumulated evidence established probable cause for criminal charges. Unlike many homicide cases, there was no confession. No eyewitness claimed to have seen fentanyl administered. No surveillance camera captured the fatal act. The case would depend largely on circumstantial evidence supported by independent corroboration. Investigators believed they were approaching the point where those separate pieces formed a complete picture. One final area of inquiry remained. They continued examining conversations and communications that prosecutors believed had occurred before Eric drank the fatal cocktail. If those conversations could be corroborated, detectives believed they might connect access to fentanyl, financial motive, and the events inside the Richins home into a single investigative timeline. As the evidence continued to accumulate, the investigation moved beyond the search for answers. It was becoming a case prosecutors believed they could present to a jury. As investigators assembled the growing body of evidence, the focus shifted from discovery to corroboration. No single witness could explain everything that had happened. No document, message, or financial record proved the case by itself. Detectives compared independent sources of evidence, looking for points where they confirmed, or contradicted, one another. The Valentine's Day illness remained part of that review. Forensic specialists continued examining electronic devices recovered during the investigation. Modern smartphones preserve an extensive record of daily life. Call logs, text messages, internet activity, photographs, location information, and financial records can collectively reconstruct timelines with remarkable precision. Investigators analyzed communications involving Eric and Kouri, comparing digital records with statements made during interviews. The investigation also continued examining the family's financial picture. Detectives reviewed business records, loan documents, construction financing, property transactions, and outstanding obligations connected to multiple real estate developments. The prosecution argued those records reflected increasing financial pressure and that Eric's growing reluctance to approve additional borrowing threatened future projects. The defense countered that developers routinely carry substantial debt while projects are underway and that financial obligations alone do not establish criminal motive. Investigators also examined Eric's estate planning. Evidence later presented at trial showed he had taken steps affecting ownership interests and authority over certain assets. Prosecutors argued those actions reflected growing concern about protecting his property and limiting financial decisions being made without his approval. The defense argued those decisions were consistent with ordinary estate planning by a business owner with young children. Insurance records received similar scrutiny. Investigators reviewed policies, beneficiaries, and related documents to understand the family's financial circumstances before and after Eric's death. The prosecution argued potential financial benefits formed part of the overall motive. The defense emphasized that life insurance is a common part of responsible financial planning and cannot, by itself, support an allegation of murder. By this stage, detectives had assembled a substantial circumstantial case. Medical experts had established the cause of death. Digital analysts had reconstructed communications and timelines. Financial investigators had documented business activity. Witnesses had described the couple's relationship, financial disagreements, and events surrounding Eric's final weeks. The question was no longer whether individual facts existed. It was whether those facts, taken together, established probable cause. Investigators concluded they did. In May 2023, more than a year after Eric Richins' death, Kouri Richins was arrested and charged with aggravated murder and related offenses. The arrest transformed a confidential homicide investigation into a case of national interest. Public attention intensified because only months earlier Kouri had published Are You With Me?, a children's book intended to help families cope with the death of a parent. The book quickly became a focus of media coverage. Inside the courtroom, however, attention remained on admissible evidence. The publication itself was not proof of guilt. The prosecution still carried the burden of proving every element of the charged offenses beyond a reasonable doubt. As pretrial proceedings unfolded, both sides revealed the framework of their cases. Prosecutors argued the evidence formed a consistent sequence: financial pressure, access to fentanyl, witness testimony, digital communications, and forensic findings all pointed toward deliberate homicide. The defense rejected that conclusion. Its attorneys argued the state relied on inferences drawn from circumstantial evidence, challenged the credibility of cooperating witnesses, disputed the prosecution's interpretation of financial records, and questioned whether the evidence excluded every reasonable alternative explanation. Months of preparation produced thousands of pages of reports, expert analyses, financial records, digital evidence, and witness statements. What had begun as an unexplained death inside a Utah home was now one of the state's most closely watched murder prosecutions. When the trial began, both sides agreed on remarkably few facts. They agreed Eric Richins had died from fentanyl toxicity. They agreed there had been no eyewitnesses. They agreed no surveillance footage captured the fatal act. Everything else would depend on how the jury interpreted the evidence. In opening statements, prosecutors told jurors they would hear evidence of careful planning driven by financial motive. They argued Eric's death was not an isolated event but the culmination of a sequence that began weeks earlier. The defense urged jurors to separate suspicion from proof. Attorneys reminded them that compelling theories are not evidence and that the state alone carried the burden of proof. The prosecution opened its case with testimony from emergency responders and investigators who described arriving at the Richins home after Eric was found unresponsive. Jurors heard how the residence was documented, evidence collected, and items preserved for laboratory examination. The medical examiner followed. Through detailed testimony, the jury learned how toxicological testing established fentanyl toxicity as the cause of death and why the concentration found in Eric's system was inconsistent with therapeutic use. During cross-examination, the defense emphasized the limits of forensic pathology. The toxicology results established how Eric died. They did not identify who administered the fentanyl or precisely when it entered his body. Those questions would have to be answered by the remaining evidence. Family members, friends, and business associates then described Eric's routines, business activities, and future plans. Several witnesses testified that he had become increasingly cautious about financial matters and wanted greater oversight of certain assets. The prosecution argued those actions reflected growing conflict within the marriage. The defense reminded jurors that disagreements over money are common and do not establish criminal intent. One of the most closely watched witnesses was the cooperating acquaintance prosecutors alleged had supplied pills before Eric's death. He testified about conversations and requests that the state argued connected Kouri to the acquisition of fentanyl. Defense attorneys challenged nearly every aspect of his credibility, questioning his criminal history, prior statements, and reasons for cooperating with investigators. Prosecutors responded by pointing jurors to the digital records and communications they argued corroborated key portions of his testimony. Ultimately, the jury would decide how much weight to give his account. Digital forensic specialists followed, explaining how investigators recovered and analyzed data from phones and electronic accounts while preserving its integrity. Rather than offering opinions about guilt, they walked jurors through call logs, text messages, timestamps, and other digital records that helped reconstruct the timeline surrounding Eric's final weeks. The prosecution argued those records supported witness testimony and demonstrated consistent patterns of communication before Eric's death. The defense maintained that while the records showed contacts occurred, they did not establish the content of every conversation or prove criminal intent. Financial investigators then presented evidence documenting the Richins family's business affairs. Jurors reviewed loan agreements, banking records, property transactions, development financing, and business obligations connected to multiple real estate projects. The prosecution argued the records revealed mounting financial pressure and showed that Eric's increasingly cautious approach to money had become an obstacle to additional borrowing and future developments. The defense offered a different interpretation. Real estate development often involves substantial debt while projects are under construction, and changing market conditions can create financial challenges even for successful developers. According to the defense, those records reflected ordinary business operations rather than evidence of motive. Jurors also heard testimony concerning Eric's estate planning. Witnesses described legal documents affecting ownership interests and authority over certain assets. Prosecutors argued those changes demonstrated Eric's growing concern about protecting his financial interests. The defense countered that business owners routinely update estate plans and ownership structures for legitimate reasons, particularly when they have young children and significant assets. Attention then returned to the Valentine's Day illness. Witnesses described Eric becoming seriously ill after a meal several weeks before his death. Prosecutors argued the episode represented an earlier attempt to poison him that ultimately failed. Defense attorneys challenged that conclusion, emphasizing that no toxicology testing had been performed at the time and that no scientific evidence established fentanyl as the cause of the illness. The prosecution asked jurors to consider the episode alongside the broader timeline. The defense urged them not to treat an unconfirmed medical event as proof of criminal conduct. Throughout the trial, the court repeatedly instructed jurors that arguments made by attorneys were not evidence. Their verdict had to rest solely on testimony presented under oath and exhibits admitted during the proceedings. As the state concluded its case, prosecutors argued that each category of evidence reinforced the others. The toxicology findings established the cause of death. Witness testimony addressed the couple's relationship and financial disputes. Digital records reconstructed communications and timelines. Financial documents supported the state's theory of motive. Taken together, prosecutors argued, the evidence established that Eric's death was not accidental but the result of deliberate poisoning. The defense challenged that conclusion on multiple fronts. Attorneys argued that the prosecution's case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence and asked jurors to examine each piece independently before considering the broader picture. They questioned the credibility of cooperating witnesses, disputed the significance of financial records, challenged portions of the investigative timeline, and argued that several of the prosecution's conclusions depended on inference rather than direct proof. The defense also emphasized that while the cause of death was not disputed, proving how fentanyl entered Eric's body, and who administered it, required evidence beyond suspicion. Throughout the proceedings, both sides returned to the same facts but offered sharply different interpretations. To the prosecution, those facts formed a continuous chain pointing toward intentional homicide. To the defense, they represented a collection of circumstances that failed to eliminate reasonable doubt. After weeks of testimony and hundreds of exhibits, both sides delivered their closing arguments. Prosecutors walked jurors through the investigation from beginning to end, arguing that independent pieces of evidence consistently pointed in the same direction. Financial motive, access to fentanyl, digital communications, witness testimony, and forensic findings, they argued, formed a coherent and compelling sequence. The defense reminded jurors that the burden of proof never shifted. Its attorneys argued that the state had presented a theory rather than certainty and that where reasonable doubt remained, the law required acquittal. With closing arguments complete, the case was submitted to the jury. Jurors began deliberating by reviewing testimony, exhibits, and the court's instructions. Their responsibility was not to resolve every unanswered question but to determine whether the prosecution had proved each charge beyond a reasonable doubt. For Eric Richins' family, the deliberations marked another step in a process that had begun with an unexpected death inside their home. For Kouri Richins, the jury's decision would determine whether the evidence presented over weeks of testimony established criminal responsibility under the law. The investigation that began with what appeared to be a sudden medical emergency had evolved into a complex homicide prosecution built on forensic science, financial records, digital evidence, and witness testimony. Now, the final decision rested with 12 jurors. The courtroom remained silent as the jury prepared to decide a case built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence. Over the course of the trial, jurors had heard testimony from emergency responders, forensic experts, financial investigators, digital analysts, family members, business associates, and cooperating witnesses. They reviewed financial records, electronic communications, toxicology reports, and estate documents. Their task was not to answer every question raised during the investigation, but to determine whether the prosecution had proved each charge beyond a reasonable doubt. Whatever verdict they reached would not change one undisputed fact. Eric Richins was dead. A husband, father, businessman, and son had lost his life under circumstances that transformed what first appeared to be a private tragedy into one of Utah's most closely watched criminal cases. For Eric's family, years had passed between his death and the trial. During that time, grief unfolded alongside an increasingly complex criminal investigation. Every court hearing, every motion, and every day of testimony became another step in a process no family ever expects to endure. For the prosecution, the case demonstrated how a homicide investigation can develop without a confession, eyewitness, or surveillance footage of the fatal act. Investigators relied instead on forensic science, digital evidence, financial records, witness testimony, and careful timeline reconstruction, arguing that each category of evidence supported the others. The defense challenged that framework at every stage. Its attorneys questioned the reliability of cooperating witnesses, disputed the prosecution's interpretation of financial evidence, and argued that suspicion, even strong suspicion, could never replace proof beyond a reasonable doubt. They reminded jurors that the burden of proof remained entirely with the state from the beginning of the trial to the very end. That adversarial process lies at the heart of the American criminal justice system. Evidence is presented under oath. Witnesses are cross-examined. Experts explain their findings. Both sides test the strength of every significant claim before the facts are placed in the hands of an impartial jury. The Richins case also reflected the growing importance of digital evidence in modern investigations. Phone records, electronic communications, financial transactions, and other digital data helped investigators reconstruct events with a level of detail that would have been impossible only a generation ago. Yet technology alone did not solve the case. Every digital record still required interpretation, corroboration, and context. The investigation likewise underscored the value, and the limitations, of circumstantial evidence. Contrary to popular belief, circumstantial evidence is not considered inherently weaker than direct evidence. Courts routinely recognize that multiple independently verified facts can establish guilt when viewed together. At the same time, each individual piece of evidence must be carefully examined, and jurors must decide whether the combined evidence excludes reasonable doubt. That was the central issue throughout this case. Not whether Eric died from fentanyl. Not whether financial disagreements existed. Not whether investigators uncovered unusual circumstances. The question was whether the totality of the evidence proved that Eric's death resulted from an intentional criminal act committed by the defendant. The case also served as a reminder of how appearances can mislead. What began as an apparent medical emergency inside a family home gradually evolved into a homicide investigation involving forensic toxicology, financial analysis, digital evidence, and years of legal proceedings. It challenged investigators to separate coincidence from pattern, motive from proof, and public speculation from admissible evidence. Beyond the legal arguments, the case left a lasting human impact. 3 children lost their father. Extended family members faced years of uncertainty while waiting for the justice system to reach its conclusions. Friends and colleagues found themselves reflecting on ordinary moments that, in hindsight, became part of an extraordinary investigation. As with every criminal prosecution, the legal process does not end when a trial concludes. Under the American justice system, convicted defendants may seek appellate review, while unresolved legal issues can continue through the courts. Appellate proceedings focus on whether the trial was conducted according to law. They are not a second opportunity to retry the facts before a new jury. For that reason, the legal history of any major criminal case can continue to evolve long after the evidence has been presented at trial. Looking back, the Richins investigation demonstrates that complex homicide cases are rarely solved by a single breakthrough. Instead, investigators assembled the case piece by piece. Each item answered one question while raising another, until detectives believed they had reconstructed what happened during Eric Richins' final days. Whether viewed through the lens of forensic science, financial investigation, or courtroom advocacy, the case illustrates the deliberate pace of the criminal justice system. Every significant conclusion was tested through investigation, challenged in court, and measured against the legal standard that governs every criminal trial. In the end, the search for answers unfolded where it was always meant to, inside a courtroom, where evidence, rather than speculation, was presented under oath, examined by both sides, and evaluated according to the rule of law.